has been allotted the privilege of introducing someone who needs no introduction. I first saw Levon Chilingirian in the early 70s when his quartet performed at the American University of Beirut. I was one of the ushers at the event, showing people to their seats. I was in awe of him then, and I'm still in awe of him now that I consider him a friend. Levon is the leader of world-renowned Chilingirian Quartet and is professor of violin and chamber music artist in residence at the Royal Academy of Music and Guildhall School of Music. This evening, he's going to take us on an exploratory tour of the uses of traditional folk music in European classical compositions and the creation of modern national identities. Over to you, Levon.
Thank you very much for your kind words. And we decided to go ahead with hopefully an uplifting evening about music, perhaps to take our minds off what is going on in Artsakh. So I'm going to talk about making music, making nations, and music nationalism. As a musical movement, nationalism emerged early in the 19th century in connection with political independence movements and was characterized by an emphasis on the regionally or locally shared musical elements, such as the use of folk songs and melodies and harmonies, folk dance rhythms, and the adoption of national historical subjects for operas, symphonic poems, or other forms of music. For many centuries, the national character of Armenian music was centered on our sung church services, folk songs and dances, the music of troubadours, and instrumental masters and singers who passed on these melodies through an oral tradition. As new nations were formed in Europe, nationalism in music was a reaction against the dominance of mainstream European classical traditions. In various countries, composers such as Chopin in Poland, Verdi in Italy, Glinka, Rimsky-Korsakov, and Borodin in Russia, Smetana and Dvořák in Czech Republic, Grieg in Norway, Sibelius in Finland, Nielsen in Denmark, Enescu in Romania, Bartok and Kodai in Hungary, Stanford, Elgar, and Vaughan Williams in the UK, as well as Ives and Copland in the US, were all pioneers of this movement. I have chosen examples from this rich list, but have concentrated on Armenian composers who worked in both Western and Eastern Armenia. Armenians were living mostly either under Ottoman or Imperial Russian rule, but here also pioneering composers were visiting Western Europe and returning home to collect folk music and blend their own compositions into new styles. Looking at Western Armenia, the first important composers emerging in Constantinople and Izmir from the mid-19th century were Yeryadandesyan, Tashjan, and Yeranyan. They and others began to incorporate European idioms into their works, such as polkas, mazurkas, and waltzes, just as composers like Grieg, as well as Johann Strauss, and of course the Polish Chopin did. However, Dikran Chukhajian was regarded as the foremost composer to try to integrate Armenian language into a European setting, despite working in an unproductive atmosphere due to the open hostility of the Ottoman government. Born in 1837 in Bolis, Khachaturian went to the Milano Conservatory studying Italian opera, and on his return created a 35-piece orchestra. His first operatic composition, Arshak Yegrot, Arshak II, was written based on the European grand opera model with choruses and ballet. The possibilities of a live performance were very rare indeed, and during his lifetime, Arshak II was only performed in its complete form in Polis, in Naples, and Vienna only. Having experienced the failure of this opera, he concentrated on the operetta genre, as the public of Bolis were already familiar with French operetta. Staged in the Turkish language, his operettas gained great success not only in Bolis, but in Tiflis, Baku, Egypt, as well as European cities. So much so that he was named as the Turkish Offenbach by critics and journalists. Naturally, people also discovered his grand opera Arshak II and hence named him the Armenian Verdi. But the popularity of musical theater in Bolis was quickly receding. Sultan Abdul Hamid was against European cultural institutions and actively persecuting the activities of Khachaturian and others. In his old age, Khachaturian was forgotten, lonely, and poor, dying in Izmir in 1898. Now, before we play the opening of Arshak Yegrot, I would just like to say, and this is, I suppose, the most important point, that although chronologically this was the first Armenian opera, I must stress that the spirit and content of Armenian folk music is almost entirely absent. So effectively, Khachaturian is not part of this musical movement, except in the inclusion of the national language. That gives you a very clear indication of the style. Of course, we recognize the Armenian language, but could very well be Italian words instead. Now, going on, from the time of the Russian occupation of Eastern Armenia in the early 19th century, more and more Armenians began to learn instruments such as the violin and the piano, becoming more familiar with Russian and Western European music. A few small orchestras were formed, as well as some military bands. Composer Armen Tigranian emerged from this context. His name has been chiefly associated with the establishment of Armenian national folk opera. Born in Gyumri in 1879, his father was a modest watchmaker. His family moved to Tiflis in 1894, where he briefly went to school. But due to financial restraints, he was forced to work in various shops and eventually returned to Gyumri. Karamurza, the famous musician, happened to be there to give a choir concert, and Tigranian joined this ensemble. In 1898, he returned to Tiflis, where he studied the flute at the Music Conservatory. He was fortunate to meet and receive great encouragement from Magar Yegmalian, with whom he studied for 2 years. He assiduously followed the musical and particularly the operatic performances in what was the cultural capital of the Caucasus. In 1902, he returned to Gyumri, where he taught music and created a choir by the end of the year. He also worked initially, or he started work on Anush opera. He actively studied and collected folk and troubadour melodies, and their spirit would eventually find their place in the arias and choruses of Anush. No actual folk melodies appear in the opera, but it feels like the music is genuinely based on Armenian songs. The first performance took place in Gyumri in 1912. This was a provincial town with no appropriate facilities, no experienced soloists, no organized orchestra or choir. Most participants were school children and students. Saro's role was sung by Nersisian Music School student Shara Dalyan and Anush by Tiflis Music School student Astrik Mardikyan. The orchestra was only 15 strong. Subsequent performances were given in Tiflis, in Baku, in Turkish, and in Moscow. Each time, revisions were undertaken in the orchestration due to the availability of larger orchestras. Tigranian also completed his second opera, David Bek, but he died in 1950 without having orchestrated it.
Աշխարհ գիտի իմն ես դու
That was the version with a larger orchestra. And although those of you who were in London, you heard a version of it done by the London Armenian opera group, which was much more like the original with a chamber orchestra. Now, we're going to move on to different countries before we return to later Armenian composers. Antonin Dvořák was born in 1841 in Bohemia, now in the Czech Republic. His father owned an inn, and as a violinist, he contributed to amateur music making that accompanied dances. He showed an early music talent, and instead of following in his father's footsteps as a butcher and innkeeper, he studied harmony, piano, and organ. He wrote his earliest works, polkas, in his mid-teens. At the age of 16, he moved to Prague to study at the Institute of Church Music. His big break came in 1875 when a state grant by the Austrian government brought him into contact with Johannes Brahms. He visited London 10 times, and in 1890, Tchaikovsky arranged 2 brilliant concerts for him in Moscow. In 1892, he accepted the post of director at the newly established National Conservatory of Music in New York. Despite spending his summers with the Czech community in a tiny town called Spillville in Iowa, he became too homesick and returned to Bohemia in 1895 and spent the last days of his life until his death in 1904. Smetana, Dvořák's senior by 17 years, had already laid the foundations of the Czech nationalist movement of music, but it was left to Dvořák to develop and extend this in an impressive series of works which quickly came to rank in popularity with those of his great German contemporaries. His music always had a strong Czech character, and his talent for melody made him a natural successor of the greatest melodist, Franz Schubert. Dvořák composed one of his most popular works, the American Quartet, after his return from America. This piece displays his national feelings based upon his people, their character, and their cultural heritage. Okay, now there were 2 distinct sections in the music we just heard. The first was very uplifting, very rhythmic, and it's got a very complex rhythm, which I think is quite difficult to capture. And it is written almost like an upbeat, but it is a downbeat where it starts. And the rhythm and the bending of the rhythm of the theme, particularly at the beginning, is very, very folk-like. In other words, if you ask a folk musician what rhythm this piece is in, they'll quite easily say it's in 2. And when we measure it in our Western way, it's actually in 3. But they would still insist to you that it's in 2, because it really is in 2. It's just that the second beat is slightly longer. And the second section was much more dark, much more broody, and as is normal in the dance movement of a symphonic piece, this provides the great contrast between the sections. Now, moving west to Norway, we hear from Edvard Grieg, born 2 years after Dvorak in 1843. After busy years in Oslo, teaching and conducting to make a living, Grieg and his wife Nina left for Hardanger, near the west coast of Norway, in 1877. In the course of the next couple of years, he wrote several masterworks, including his quartet in G minor, or G-moll, as it's known in Norway. Liszt admired this work greatly, and Grieg himself characterized the quote as a slice out of his own life. He characterized the quartet as a slice out of his own life. Quote, concealed within it are samples of that heart's blood, of which posterity hopefully will see more than just a few drops. The main theme is derived from Grieg's Ibsen song, Minstrel. In 1925, Fridtjof Nansen, the great humanitarian activist and one of the modern Norway's founding fathers, visited Soviet Armenia on behalf of the League of Nations to work out a scheme of giving Armenian refugees a home by irrigating barren land. He succeeded in the repatriation of nearly 7,000 Armenians. On his last evening in Yerevan on July the 1st, 1925, a concert was given in his honor. Nansen wrote, a concert in which we heard Grieg's G minor quartet and several compositions by Armenian composers such as Spendiaryan, Sayat-Nova, and various folk songs. The music was very pleasing and well executed. I was told that Grieg was particularly popular in Armenia, a certain affinity being found between his music and that of the Armenians. tying into what Nansen said about the affinity of Grieg with Armenian music, there is a very old and wonderful recording of the original Gomidas Quartet playing this piece. So obviously, it was very much part of the repertoire of Armenian musicians from the third decade of the 20th century. Now, going back eastwards towards Romania, we meet George Enescu. He was born in Moldova in 1881, the same year as Béla Bartók. He studied in Vienna and Paris, where he wrote his second violin sonata. In 1899, he wrote, quote, "I felt myself evolving rapidly. I was becoming myself. Until then, I was fumbling. From that moment, I felt able to walk on my own legs, even if not yet able to run very fast." His third sonata was written in the Romanian folk style in 1926. He performed it many times, both as a violinist and as pianist. Enescu, by the way, was the teacher of Yehudi Menuhin and subsequently established orchestras, music colleges, and the opera house in Romania. You will now hear the third sonata, sounding like a total improvisation of Romanian Moldovan folk music. Here it is performed with the incomparable mastery of Enescu on the violin and Dinu Lipati, his godson, and one of the truly great pianists of the 20th century, who died tragically young at the age of 33 in 1950. I could listen to the whole thing, sorry, had to stop there, but you can see the amazing, amazing improvisational character, the genuine folk music. No bowing to, Western traditions. It just sounds like the two of them are sitting there and improvising. Just a great, not only a great piece, but very, very brilliantly played by the two. We move on to Béla Bartók. He was born in 1881 in Hungary, spent much of his life collecting the folk music, not only of his native country, but many surrounding lands, even venturing as far as afield as North Africa. Before writing his second string quartet in 1915 to 1917, he had made arrangements of at least 150 Hungarian, Romanian, and Slovakian folk songs, mostly for piano. With the outbreak of the First World War, the possibilities of collecting further folk songs in the villages were greatly diminished, and this may have played an important part in the creation of the works like his second string quartet. With this work, he succeeded in applying the idiom of folk music to an extended instrumental composition. This idiom had now become so much second nature to him that the most characteristic intervals, rhythms, phrase structures, and harmonies of Hungarian folk music permeate every bar. By the way, a statue of Bartók stands just outside South Kensington Underground Station in London. I would just like to add, without an illustration, something about Vaughan Williams, the English composer. He was born in 1872 and died in 1958. And in England, he collected, published, and arranged many folk songs from across the country, as well as small and large-scale orchestral works, such as the Fantasia on Greensleeves and his 9 symphonies. He defined musical nationalism, writing that, quote, "The art of music, above all other arts, is the expression of the soul of the nation." Vaughan Williams broke his ties with continental Europe, that for 2 centuries, through Handel, Mendelssohn, and lesser German composers, had made Britain virtually a musical province of Germany. You may, in your own time, sample his music through one of his most enduring pieces. It's called The Lark Ascending for violin and orchestra, and you will hear it also very frequently on Classic FM. Now, we return to Armenian composers who followed on from Khachaturian and Tigranian. Sarkis Aslamazyan was born in 1896 in Mozdok in Russia, where he received his early musical education from his father. He later studied at the Moscow Conservatory, where he subsequently taught cello and chamber music for more than 40 years. In 1925, Coincidentally, the year of Nansen's visit to Armenia, Aslamazyan was the cellist founding member of a string quartet in Moscow, all 4 players being Armenian. Upon the death of Gomidas and the burial of his remains in Yerevan in 1936, the quartet was renamed the Gomidas String Quartet. Over many years of touring in the Soviet Union, Europe, and also the United States in the early 1960s, Aslamazyan created 17 works for string quartet, based mostly on the songs and dances notated from Armenian villages by Gomidas. The first set of pieces were published as early as 1934, and all 17 settings were later published in Yerevan. Aslamazyan died in Moscow in 1978, the same year as Khachaturian. From the early days of the Chilingirian Quartet in the 1970s, we included the Aslamazyan pieces both in our concert programs as well as encores. After many years of giving summer courses in Norway, a whole generation of young string players grew up knowing these pieces and also performing them regularly from copies made from our parts. I always felt that Aslamazyan's harmonization showed an allegiance to Edvard Grieg. I think I can just add that why do these pieces exist? It's because in their very successful concert career, people kept on asking them, why don't you play music from your own country? And there was nothing written for string quartet, except for a very short rejected piece by our next composer, Khachaturian. So Aslamazyan over many years made these wonderful, very individual arrangements in his own color, very, very different from Gomidas's realizations of these folk songs and dances. So Aram Khachaturian, the next composer, was born in Tiflis in 1903. He came from a poor family. In 1921, he moved to Moscow and studied the cello and then transferred to the composition class in 1929. He was always fascinated by Armenian folk music and Oriental sounds and melodies. His piano concerto in 1936 was quickly followed by his violin concerto composed in 1940 during the Second World War in the tranquility of a woodland retreat west of Moscow. Khachaturian said that, quotes, he worked without effort. Themes came to me in such an abundance that I had a hard time putting them in order. Like Anush, there are no direct quotes from specific folk melodies, and yet the whole concerto is infused with Armenian scales and modes. The dedicatee, David Oistrach, was the perfect ambassador of this work. And amongst his many performances and recordings, I have chosen the very special one with Khachaturian conducting, Oistrach as soloist, with the Philharmonia Orchestra led by my uncle Manuk Parekyan, recorded in London in 1954. And the photo that you see, Khachaturian at the conductor's podium, my uncle Manuk with the violin under his right arm, and David Oistrach on the right, showing what he wanted to do. And it was a fascinating trio because Oistrach spoke Russian and German, I believe. Khachaturian definitely spoke Russian and Armenian, of course, and maybe a few other languages, but neither of them spoke English. And that's where my poor uncle came into the picture. So Oistrach would give his request in Russian to Khachaturian, who would translate it into Armenian to my uncle, who would then translate it into English for the orchestra. Anyway, it's a scintillating performance, and we're going to hear the beginning of the last movement. Red hot playing, and I had the great fortune of hearing David Oistrach play live towards the end of his life, and he was the king, really. And I also had the good fortune of meeting Khachaturian on his last visit to London, where he gave me the copy of his solo violin sonata monologue. So there is some sort of direct link coming from both those people, as well as my, of course, late uncle Manuk, who was my inspiration. We now go on to Arno Babajanyan, who was born in 1921 and studied music and composition at the Yerevan and Moscow conservatories. His piano playing was superb, so much so that Emil Gilels, the great Russian pianist, was one of his most ardent admirers. His piano trio was written in 1952 and is a fiery work reminiscent of both Khachaturian and Rachmaninov, as well as Prokofiev and Bartók. He later wrote a violin sonata, which I had the honor of playing with him in Paris in the late 1970s. Our first meeting just before the concert at a friend's house was a true baptism of fire for me, when we played straight through the piece, with Arno challenging me to keep up with him. The last time I saw him was in 1981, when I went to his dasha at the composer's home in Dilijan. He played me some of his latest Estradain, popular compositions, and then gave me a tour of the beautiful surrounding countryside. He died in 1983. You will hear some of the wild finale of his piano trio. Now, just the bit we listened to, that beautiful melody, very reminiscent of, Khachaturian, let's say, but the accompaniment that is given to the piano is unbelievably complex. And above it, the cello and the violin play this very, very simple and moving melody. And I suppose that aspect of Babajanyan as a composer, that he really fancied himself, not only, of course, as a great melodist, but his rhythmic complexities were very, very much of the age that he was in. And he somehow married the two things of the Armenian music and its spirit, but with the rhythmic complexity of somebody like Béla Bartók and later composers. Finally, we go to my dear friend, Tigranian Mansurian. He was born in Beirut in 1939. His family emigrated to Armenia in 1947. He studied at the Yerevan Conservatory, where he would become director immediately after Armenian independence. In the 1960s, he was attracted to the Western avant-garde, but became increasingly convinced of the importance of the spirit of place and composing in an authentically Armenian voice. He is deeply steeped in his country's folk tradition. He said, quote, "Our position on the map of music and culture is exactly on the spot where East and West meet." He wrote the music for Parajanov's Color of Pomegranates and dedicated his 2-cello quintet, Dadanumner, and his 3rd-string quartet to the Chilingirian Quartet. In 2007, his 2nd violin concerto, subtitled 4 Serious Songs, was commissioned by the Camerata Nordica in Sweden, and as dedicatee, I was privileged to give its premiere. Inspired by Brahms's 4 late songs, this piece is infused by Armenian modes throughout, and the very beginning illustrates the dark colors and emotions expressed in the conversation of violin and orchestra. His Requiem, by the way, written for the centenary commemoration of the Armenian genocide in 1915, is a truly defining work of Armenian music. That brings us with I guess, a suitably sad, reflective mood to where we are today. I'm sure that Tikran in Yerevan will be feeling our pain and anxiety even more strongly. And anyway, I hope that this has sort of illustrated a few pieces which maybe you were not familiar with up to now. And at this point, really, apart from thanking Susan for doing all the things that I'm totally incapable of doing with this computer in front of me, I would be very, very happy to answer any questions that you might have.